IISD reporting subsidies in Bonn for the first UN climate change talks following the conclusion of the Paris Agreement. Today we covered a side event that discussed one of the most complex themes of the climate agenda, fossil fuel subsidies.
You know, in international processes like the UNFCCC, we tend to think the big guys run the show, but the reality is smaller countries have a really useful, important role to play. And one of the standout examples, I think, of that has been the fossil fuel subsidies push coming from a group of friends of fossil fuel subsidy reform. We are all non-G20 countries, so we're not big guys. But one thing we have in common, I think, is a very strong conviction that reforming fossil fuel subsidies has to be one of the main tracks of the push to implement the Paris Agreement.
So what we find from research is that by phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, governments can save around $93 per tonne of carbon abated. And that's the first step in getting energy prices right and carbon prices right and fiscal policies conducive to having good plans moving forward on adaptation.
There are estimates on the cost of adaptation that are higher than we ever thought they were. And there are estimates on how much financing is available and that there's a gap between what's needed and what's available. The size of that gap is up for debate, I would say, but the fact that there is a gap is important, and so we need to contend with that. And filling that gap is not just going to be through international public resources. It's also going to be countries looking at their own domestic resources.
In terms of the financing needs under the Paris Agreement, I mean, we've got a target or a commitment to supplying, working towards $100 billion a year in financing to support mitigation, adaptation and so on. And yet, when you look at the amount of funding that's going into fossil fuel subsidies worldwide, we're talking about an amount that's 6 times in fact, that figure of $100 billion. About $500 billion a year goes into consumer subsidies and a further $100 billion a year into producer subsidies. Total $600 billion. That's an immense amount of money.
Despite being difficult, the side event showed how an effective implementation of a fossil fuel subsidy reform can be an effective tool to combat climate change.
Another reason why it's important to get rid of fossil fuel subsidies is because emissions reductions could be between around 6 to 13% by 2015 from making this fiscal policy change through a phased removal of these subsidies. So it's a policy tool that not only saves governments money, $93 per tonne of carbon abated, but it also reduces emissions.
The last 10 years, our fleet has increased in an enormous way. I think it has been an increase of more than 85%. I mean, the numbers are very, very scary. And we are now discussing this idea of having an emission fee to see as a new tool, to be implemented and to see if we can have new sources of income. And the idea will be to use this money to improve our public transport systems and also air quality, to have a monitoring systems of air quality, which is becoming also a really bad thing that we're having in our cities. And the idea right now with this fee is that we're basing this in this polluters pay principles, and the idea is that, I mean, every time you take your card and you're using this card for a long time, you're generating all this pollution, and somebody must pay for it.
It's important not to pretend that it's simple or easy or quick. The politics around changing subsidies are always complicated, whether they're at the producer level or at the consumer level. But at a time when we're looking for financing to support this critical work of implementing the Paris Agreement, we simply cannot ignore that huge amount of public money that's currently going into subsidies.
During this event, the debate on fossil fuel subsidy reforms was strictly connected to the opportunity to enhance funds for adaptation. As more governments are trying to get prices right, we want to understand what are the opportunities and sectors that could benefit from the elimination of fossil fuels.
So an obvious one would actually be infrastructure. But not just any infrastructure, this is climate resilient infrastructure. And so this also speaks to the importance of integrating adaptation into policies and planning processes so that, for example, if governments are faced with this opportunity to allocate domestic revenues to infrastructure projects, which is identified as a core economic development need, then if adaptation's already integrated into the policies and the programs, the infrastructure policies and programs, then you're supporting adaptation and resilience building.
Sometimes the situation with countries' fiscal policies around fossil fuels, over-subsidization, complete under-taxation, or lack of VAT, reminds me of perhaps where we were with smoking many years ago, before we really understood that smoking was bad for our health. Sometimes it feels like with fossil fuel subsidies, it's like handing out free packets of cigarettes, paying people to smoke. But we need to be doing the opposite, and that's what we learned as we understood how smoking impacts our health and the costs of that to society. We began putting in more regulations, we put taxes on cigarettes, and that meant that it put people off smoking. And so that's the same kind of progression that we're seeing now on fossil fuels. Start to remove the subsidies that incentivize consumers and businesses to use more upstream and downstream, and then start to put in disincentives, so duties or levies, small taxes, and those that capture externalities. There's pollution effects from carbon and diesel and so on. So put these in to raise the price, to again change consumer behavior, business behavior. So that's where we're at, and this is what governments are doing. The Philippines, Morocco, Indonesia, India, and it doesn't all happen at once, it's a slow progress. And the potential to raise huge amounts of revenue for domestic resources, for adaptation plans, to invest back into renewables, to put back into energy efficiency is just really large. If we properly cost in all of the externalities and tax carbon appropriately, or put in an appropriate carbon price, you're looking about 2.6% of global GDP. It's definitely something governments should be considering when they're thinking about the financial mix for how they fund adaptation plans, be it from domestic sources, donor revenues, private finance.